Welcome to Let's Just Talk. I'm your host, Hammi. Joining us today is Professor Khalid Mustafa Medani, Associate Professor of Political Science and Islamic Studies at McGill University, where he is also the Director of the Islamic Institute Studies Program and the Chair of the African Studies Program. Most importantly, he is a fellow Brown alumni. Dr. Medani, welcome to Let's Just Talk.
Thank you very much, Hamidou. It's a real honor and pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Thank you for being here. Dr. Medani, as you know, over 12,000 people dead, more than 6 million people displaced in Sudan since the fighting between rival forces or military factions erupted in April. The UN's humanitarian coordinator for Sudan, Clementine Nkweta Salami, says, "We are running out of words to describe the horror of what is happening in Sudan." She says, "We continue to receive unrelenting and appalling reports of sexual and gender-based violence, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detention, and grave violations of human and children's rights." She finishes by saying what is happening is verging on pure evil. As we speak, countless innocent civilians continue to experience and face unimaginable horrors. Can you describe the current situation and its gravity for our audience members who may not be aware of what is happening on the other side of the world in Sudan?
Yes, of course. I think you captured it very well with your citations of particularly international aid agencies. The UNHCR has called it perhaps the worst humanitarian crisis in modern history. And this, of course, is very akin to the tragedy that happened in Rwanda in the 1990s. In addition to that, the Doctors Without Borders organization has called it a failure of humanity. Given the lack of attention, not only in terms of the media, but even in terms of humanitarian assistance and delivery in the context of such a grave humanitarian crisis. And so a crisis that, as you put it, began on April 15th in the capital of Khartoum, the greater Khartoum area, the capital city, one of Africa's largest capital cities, housing approximately 11 million, is essentially now a ghost town. I think what is not captured in the figures of the 6 million displaced internally, over 1 million refugees in neighboring countries, perhaps over 100,000 now in Chad, maybe 200,000 in Egypt, not to mention others fleeing to South Sudan, Ethiopia, and neighboring countries, does not capture the humanitarian crisis in terms of the destruction of the infrastructure. Of first the capital city. We're talking about 70% of health facilities destroyed. People are dying not only of extrajudicial killings, forced disappearance and displacement as a result of the aerial bombardments and the street battles in Khartoum, but they're dying from curable diseases. Malaria, people who have conditions such as diabetes have no access to medicines, life-saving medicines. So in addition to the figures, the daily kind of violence, not only the awful kind of rape and sexual assault as a tragedy of war, is just kind of gives you even a more severe picture of what we mean when we say it's a humanitarian grave humanitarian crisis. In the context of that, the conflict now has multiplied in terms of where it was really centered on Khartoum and between two belligerents, two generals who are vying for political power and economic control, has now really morphed, unfortunately, into local level violence, as you see, for example, in Darfur. Essentially rooted in political power struggles, particularly between the Rapid Support Forces militias and the Sudan Armed Forces in Darfur. Now we see in the latest news coming out of Darfur, you can see it in the report of Human Rights Watch that just came out last year, talking about ethnic killings. Here, we have a war that began as a political struggle, even in Darfur, has morphed into really unprecedented, even by the early Darfur War of 2003, into local level conflicts. In the case of northern Darfur, just to give you an example, a very fragile truce that was built very kind of carefully by local community leaders has been upended by the violence on the part of the armed forces and the rapid support forces militias, leading to settling scores, so to speak, kind of ethnic level violence. We also have, if you don't mind me saying, disorganization with respect to command and control. No longer do the leaders even of the rapid support forces militias under the helm of Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo have control over their forces. What that means, of course, is increasing multifaceted forms of conflicts in the Darfur area. I mentioned that not only to express the evolving nature of the conflict, but also to highlight when we do speak about attempts to resolve this tragedy, that the nature of the conflict, its evolving nature and dynamics must be taken into account as we start speaking about resolving this conflict.
Right. Before we even get into how it's evolving and how the conflict is becoming much more complex or as time goes on, I want to place this conflict into historical context. And number one, talk about who are the domestic actors and help our audience understand how we came to this point in Sudan. So if you can take a second to talk about, you mentioned rapid support forces. Who are those? And then we can also talk about who are the SAF, who is Burhan, who is Hemeti, who is Hamdak, all these different actors that you've mentioned. Let's talk about the most important figures and then place them in context to how they contributed to where we are today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for asking that question. I'm going to start, and I'll try to make it as succinct as possible, with one of the most historic events on the continent of Africa that occurred in December 2018. There is no revolution, pro-democracy, youth-led revolution that really could be considered similar to what occurred in Sudan. Millions throughout the country, and I think many of your listeners and viewers are familiar with the attention that Sudan received, and an unprecedented wave of protest against 30 years of dictatorship, primarily led by two very important segments of Sudanese society. The resistance committees, the young people organized to fight this authoritarian regime of 30 years, led by Mohammed Omar Bashir, and at the time, an organization called the Sudan Professional Association that coordinated with the street protesters throughout this very large country, leading in April of 2019 to the fall of Omar Bashir. This is really important because in many ways, this war is really a fight against these young people in Sudan. And I think many in Africa who are familiar with street protests, whether it's Burkina Faso or even the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, will understand the power of youth-led protest and mobilization. And this is why I want to emphasize that this is very much a war against the young people of Sudan, who had strived very hard in order to upend dictatorship and form and achieve a revolution. What occurred after this revolution in April of 2019 was a compromise, a fatal now compromise between the military leaders led by General Abdel Fattah Burhan, who's currently the leader of the Sudan Armed Forces. He's the leader of the military, and an organization called the Forces of Freedom of Change, civilian leaders. Rather than continue with the revolution to dismantle the vestiges of the dictatorship of 30 years led by an Islamist movement, what occurred was a compromise between civilian leaders and military leaders. That, I think, for many in Sudan, begins the story of this present war. But really, to bring things very much up to date, it really is the continued protest among young people and others in Sudan that led to a coup in October 25th of 2021. This coup, and I think your listeners and viewers would be surprised to learn, was really waged as a partnership between the present belligerents to the war. The Burhan, the general who heads the Sudan Armed Forces, and Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who is the leader of the militia, the paramilitary militia, called the Rapid Support Forces, that was born or basically a branch of the Janjaweed that was established by the former regime. So a very important point here, because maybe some of your listeners and viewers are not familiar, is that the paramilitary militia organized around the Rapid Support Forces was actually established by the former regime and the military, and B, legitimated under law by that military as a partner to them to do two things: to put down dissent in Khartoum and the young people, killing hundreds upon hundreds of pro-democracy activists, and also putting down any insurgency in Darfur. Now, the question, of course, becomes, as you can imagine, for people unfamiliar with Sudan, is following this partnership, what happened? How could we go from this kind of partnership between the militia and the Sudan armed forces to a war of unprecedented kind of violence? And that happened with something called the Framework Agreement, the continued protest against the coup of October 2021, forced both these belligerents, these generals, to sit around the table with the civilian opposition under the auspices of the international community and try to return the country to a transition to democratic civilian rule. Very quickly, in a nutshell, two contentious issues emerged in the framework agreement that have catalyzed and led to this awful war. Right. One was the insistence on the opposition that the vast wealth and institutions of the military and the militia be dismantled in order to remove the deep state or upend the deep state that had obstructed any kind of transition to civilian rule and freedoms. The other is what catalyzed the war, and that was a disagreement over the merging of the militia into the National Standing Army. That disagreement is in the calculations, particularly of the Sudan Armed Forces and of course the militia, was an existential threat to both of them. And it is following this contentious disagreement, with the military wanting it to happen very quickly over 2 years, and the militia under Dagalo wanting it to happen over a very long time, 10 years, essentially refusing to integrate the militia into the army, is what led on April 15th of this year to the violence and the war, which now pits the Sudan Armed Forces, led by Burhan and supported by the remnants of the Islamist regime of the past, with the Rapid Support Forces. And this is what catalyzed the war. It continues to be the primary reason behind this awful war, a zero-sum game, so to speak, with respect from the part of the calculations of both the head of the military, the Sudan Armed Forces, and the Rapid Support Forces. You asked about Abdullah Hamdok. He is someone who was chosen by the civilian opposition to become the prime minister. His role is important in the sense that in retrospect, and even at the time, Sudanese civil society organizations, and particularly the resistance committees, did not feel that he had the legitimacy in civil society, or really, frankly, the resolve and the acumen in order to help to transition this government. He, of course, resigned after the coup of October 21st, leading to the complete fragmentation of the civil society opposition. And that fragmentation provided a very important context for this war as well.
Right. So to sum this up, please correct me if I'm wrong. There was a long, brutal dictatorship by Omar that was halted by majority youth-led pro-democracy protest in Sudan, which led to Hammi and Burhan siding with the civilians to overthrow Omar. And these two figures, Burhan being in charge of the Sudan armed forces and Hammi being in charge of the Rapid Support Forces, made promises to the civilians of ending the dictatorship and bringing the democratic institutions that people had been protesting for for months, and many died for. And in a power struggle between these two, in terms of how to end this, because they had no intention to give back, turn the power to civilian rule. International actors intervened, created a transitional council, and put Burhan and Hemeti in charge of this transitional council. And at a divergence or conflict between these two of one wanting the rapid support forces to be part of the armed forces in 2 years, and the rapid support forces leader saying, no, this is going to happen in 10 years. It led to a power struggle where now millions of civilians are caught in the crossfires and people are dying. Is this a fair summation of how we got here?
It is, absolutely, with one very important clarification, because I know that you and, of course, your listeners and viewers are interested in other African contexts. The point you made about Burhan and Dagalo, known as Hemeti, siding with the revolutionaries as against Bashir, it needs a clarification.
Right.
From the very beginning, and many of us knew that, and in retrospect, it's clear, neither of them had any intention of supporting. What the intention was is what we call in political science, by the way, upgrading authoritarianism.
Right.
You'll see it in Sudan and elsewhere. And that is to what we call in Sudan, engage in or implement a soft landing. Basically, to do what in rhetoric, this kind of discourse of supporting a transition to democracy, but really basically solidifying military rule. Why is this important?
We see it all over the continent, and it's kind of as absurd that, like, whenever these things happen, international actors always seem to back the military forces that say, first of all, the military forces who have no incentive to give back the power to the civilians, they tend to back them. For example, in Guinea, we had something similar when Lansana Conte, who was the long-term dictator of the country, passed away. We had Dadis, who was a military leader, came into power and promised transition. And then he decided, no, I'm going to stay. And then it led to much more wider conflict and him having to be overthrown as well. And then is the same story over and over and over and again. You know, Mark Twain has the saying, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So we have the same tune playing over and over again. And international actors that tend to intervene, it seems as though they don't really take into account the voices of the people on the ground who are fighting for their own right to self-determination and who will lead them and so on. But I don't want to get bogged down in this point because we have a lot of other things to cover. I want to move on to, since we've talked about external actors and influencers and players, who are the specific external actors and influencers, players involved in what's happening in the Sudan? And why is the Sudan so important to all of these different players?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. The reason that Sudan is so important, it's important to emphasize, is on one level, pure geography. It is one of the largest countries on the continent. It borders 7 countries. It is a very important country with respect to the Sahel region, Chad, and of course, going all the way to Mali and West Africa. And as you know, it borders the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Which makes it both strategically important for those involved in the very rich, resource-rich Sahel region, but it also makes it very important in terms of the Red Sea area. The port of Port Sudan is extremely strategic for a variety of different actors. It's, of course, as you know, the Indian Ocean is a source of competition for America, for China, for Russia, and of course, for the Gulf region. And so there has been historically always a conflict over who is going to take control or have influence over the Red Sea area of Sudan. Only recently, over the past few days, as an example, port workers in the Port of Sudan on the Red Sea have been protesting to kick out the ambassador of the United Arab Emirates. Which historically had wanted to have control and build their own facilities in Port Sudan. So this is just an example. You have the Sahel on one side and the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. In addition to that, Sudan is distinguished in many instances as being both an African and Middle Eastern Arab country. And so the potential, number one, of a democratic Sudan poses a threat to a number of countries, most importantly, of course, Egypt, which is very, very close in Sudan, not only culturally, but politically. That kind of so-called, if you don't mind me using the term, from their perspective, a contagion of democratization, is one of the reasons what we call counter-revolutionary forces in North Africa have worked tirelessly to upend any kind of popular mobilization leading to democracy. That's really important. Another issue of external actors, and here it's key, are Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Both of them have strategic interest in the, of course, Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, of course, but they also have vast economic and financial interest within Sudan in agriculture, and also they perceive Sudan as a gateway to the African markets and resources further afield, south, even to the below the Sahara. And so you have a constellation of different interests that are vying. You have on the other side, of course, Ethiopia and its battle with Egypt over the Nile waters, which makes Sudan, of course, principally an existential kind of security issue, both for Egypt and for Ethiopia. In other words, who has influence over the government in Sudan may have influence over this very important water source, the life-giving and energy source of the Nile. And at the same time, they also can forestall or want to forestall any kind of pro-democratic mobilization that could influence these other regions. And finally, or not finally, it's very important to understand the role of Islamism, Islamist politics. Sudan and the regime that was led by Omar al-Bashir is really the only, or was the only regime in the region where a Sunni Arab country, Arab-speaking country, was led by an Islamist authoritarian regime. This, of course, poses a threat to Saudi Arabia that is very much opposed to the Islamist movement. It does so also for Egypt and less so for the United Arab Emirates. But to emphasize the present war, and your question, and I think that to simplify matters, so to speak, the United Arab Emirates, we now know, is supplying both financial and military supplies and aid and assistance to the rapid support forces. And this has having a severe impact on the devastation in Darfur, as just one example. And that's important to keep in mind. Egypt also is supporting the army. And so here you have external actors, each supporting a different actor or belligerent in the war. And so, as you know, in all of these conflicts, and thank you for this question, it is not to say that the roots of the conflict, whether in Sudan or elsewhere, are not domestic, but it's important to understand that the sustainability and the dynamics of the conflict are really a result of external intervention and interest. Why is that important? Because it speaks to the efficacy of the peace talks now brokered by Saudi Arabia and the United States versus peace talks brokered, let's say, by the African Union and the regional bloc of IGAD of East and the Horn of Africa. And so we must take into account the specificities and the dramatic influence of external interests, interventions, in this conflict, because without that, we won't understand the dynamics of the conflict and even begin to discuss how we can resolve this tragedy in Sudan.
Right. There is so many different interests taking part in this. And a lot of people on social media right now also mentioning words like proxy war. And especially in some US media outlets, the over-amplification of the role of the Wagner Group in Sudan. Could you talk about the dangers of this increasingly interventionist movements from across the globe, from the US to Saudi Arabia to Russia to regional actors and everyone else involved? And then you mentioned different peace resolution, people coming together to like advocate for ceasefires and so on. What is the difference between the African Union and what it's doing versus what the other actors are doing? Because whether it is happening in Africa or whether it is happening from outside of Africa, it seems none of these actors have a vested interest in a stabilized, democratic, civilian-led, peaceful, thriving Sudan.
Yes, absolutely. I think that one of the things that is not often considered when looking at African conflicts, although we do have people, of course, talking about the new scramble for Africa, but specifically about these conflicts, they're usually represented as a tragedy, as you put it earlier, between just kind of illogical, irrational, belligerence, or Africans are prone to interethnic enmities and violence. Of course, that's a normal state of affairs. What can we do about it? And the problem is that what is obscured is the fact that all of these conflicts, and Sudan is a prime example, are really played out in a much larger regional geopolitical terrain.
Mm-hmm.
The war in Ukraine is not peripheral to the conflict in Sudan. And what I mean by that is that the scramble for power over the Sahel, for example, is now between not only China, of course, and the US, but France's issues with respect to the Sahel region and its the opposition to it and its history of colonization and occupation. But also Russia is now battling, so to speak, the United States and the West in the Sahel region. And here is where the Wagner Group comes into play. Despite what people may say about the death of the traditional head of the Wagner Group, it is very much a proxy of Russian policy and geopolitics. In many instances, it continues to be very close to the Kremlin. It also is very important in generating gold and smuggled not only to the United Arab Emirates, which receives the bulk of the smuggled gold, but also it's smuggled through Syria to Russia. Most importantly, we have to understand that it plays a very important political, strategic role in that it represents Russia's influence and interest in Africa, as opposed in contradistinction and as a rival to, let's say, US interest and the European Union's interest. So from their perspective, their calculations are with respect to the situation in Sudan is very much either based on that or the fear on the part of the European Union, not so much about, perhaps ending the war, so to speak, but the potential of immigration from Sudan or others to the European Union. Here, all of these interests must be taken into account, not only in Sudan, but in other conflicts, to understand that these conflicts are played out in a much larger geopolitical terrain. And that's what makes them very, very essential. Now, in terms of democracy and peace for Sudan, you have to pose it in a different way, perhaps. I often do that, and that is, what threat does democracy and peace represent for actors? Rather than understand or believe or take kind of without any criticism, this notion that these Western countries, for example, want democracy, we have to understand that a democratic government in Sudan would be unreliable to many of these interests. The will of the Sudanese people who participate in elections may have very different views with respect to military regimes in the region, the use of resources domestically, the smuggling of gold. Sudan is the third largest exporter of gold in the African continent. All of these issues threaten a variety of different interests if a democracy or the will of the people is consolidated. And of course, the majority of Sudanese, especially young people, understand that full well.
Right. And for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to the next issue, which is the United Nations ending its political mission in Sudan. There's just been an article about that. While simultaneously that's happening, Human Rights Watch is urging the United Nations not to end its mission in Sudan because an estimated death toll of between 1,300, 1,300 and 2,000 Masalit people have been massacred by the Rapid Support Forces. And some of the people who escaped the conflict that were interviewed by different international organizations mentioned how the ethnically identified Arabs groups in the region came out looking for the Black Sudanese and they went door to door looking for any men in the villages or in the cities who happened to be Black, and massacred them in the thousands. And so that then, what does it mean for international organizations to give up on Sudan? And how is ethnicity or differences influencing what's happening on the ground? And is there any pathway forward in this situation for the innocent people caught in the crossfire?
Sure. Thank you for that question. Absolutely. Let me begin with the latter part of your question about the role of ethnicity, because the framing of the conflict is really crucial.
Right.
Of course, I'm familiar with the reports of Arabs, hunting down Black people in Darfur.
Right.
The situation is far more complicated. I've been to Darfur several times, including during the previous war. And the situation in Darfur, in terms of understanding divisions, like the majority of the Sahel region, has to do with the relationship of forms of economic livelihood, pastoralist versus agriculturalist, for example.
Okay.
This is not to say that there isn't violence ethnically based. That is absolutely true. That's why at the beginning of this interview, I tried to emphasize there's a mutation of the dynamics of the conflict.
So
but the reason I mentioned that, it's transitioning, but the reason I emphasize how we must be careful, that's describing the conflict versus really understanding the roots of the conflict, sometimes come into contradiction. What this kind of rhetoric and discourse analysis of Arabs versus Africans does is it basically absolves the perpetrators of this violence. It absolves the rapid support forces from the violence they're meted out, and the way that they're utilizing and instrumentalizing inter-ethnic divisions of a kind of traditional type for their own military strategic ends. This is key. I can tell you for a fact, if you do a little bit more research, that what is really happening in Darfur is, and what has happened previously, is mediators historically that have brought these groups together are being assaulted. This is why the leaders of the Masalid, the leaders of the Zaghawa, and the leaders of the Rizegat as well, these are Arabized, these are pastoralist groups considered to be Arabized, who are being eliminated in order to make way for the scorched earth policy that actually serves the strategic and military means of the RSF. One of the indications of that is that, as brutal as the RSF is, they have been unable to maintain a sustained hold among these different regions in different parts of Darfur. Why? Is because they're universally unpopular. I want you to think about it in common sense. Why would villagers really prefer to go at each other without any cognizance or consciousness about who the perpetrators are? Why would they engage in meticulous peace building at the community level, let's say in Al-Fashir in northern Darfur, if they felt that they were in an existential, inevitable death spiral with their neighbors and co-villagers and sometimes. And so it's very important to be very clear about describing how ethnicity is instrumentalized, but that should not stop us from understanding the root sources of the conflict. And I have to insist on this because I've worked on it for 30 years and been to Darfur, and I researched this particular topic at that time. And of course, people now have been written about it. It should not excuse what is happening in any way, but we want to be clear. Did I miss another part of your question?
No. This is good. I'm glad you you clarified how ethnicity and usually identity within conflict, especially in the African context, tends to be sort of leveraged and used in support of whatever the perpetrators are trying to get done. Now, that is not mutually exclusive with saying that specific groups are being targeted, because this is part of a strategic effort to a means to an end.
Absolutely. Well put. Yes,
and then
absolutely.
To continue from there, under international law, deliberate attacks on civilian populations, including extrajudicial killings, mistreatment of civilians, and all those not participating in combat, such as detainees and the wounded, and forcible displacement, violate the laws of war and may be prosecuted as war crimes. Now, also acts of murder, rape, torture, deportation, persecution, and other offenses committed as part of a widespread or systemic attack against a civilian population based on a governmental or organizational policy constitutes crimes against humanity. Now, it is no secret that the ICC acts like a prosecutor for the African continent, because outside of Putin, nobody who was not from the African continent has been to the ICC. But in a post-war situation in Sudan, what does accountability look like? And who will get to hold these people accountable, if at all? And then I want to end on a good note. Is there any pathway forward for peace in Sudan? And what can people outside of Sudan who are demoralized from everything they're seeing do to support the innocent people on the ground?
Thank you very much. Let me just be very clear. There can be no future peace in Sudan without accountability. This was a central principle of the pro-democratic revolution. It is the central demand of the majority of the Sudanese, particularly the young people who represent over 60% of the population. Every part of upgrading authoritarianism and the soft landing I spoke about was to do everything possible on the part of both military and civilian elites to defer the issue of accountability. Number one. Number two, accountability now is being instrumentalized by the armed forces, citing the huge violations, of course, of the rapid support forces. The reason I say that's instrumentalized is because, on the other hand, they refuse to acknowledge that their own forces, through aerial bombardments, through extrajudicial killings, through targeting of journalists and innocent people and hospitals, for them, that is not should not be under the purview of accountability. So the future, in addition to that, following this war, people like Ahmed Haroun, who's already indicted by the ICC, he's a very virulent Islamist responsible for the ethnic cleansing in Darfur in the early 2000s, was let out of prison along with other Islamist militants in order to help to prosecute this war along the side of the Sudan armed forces. What that means is that there has to be external mechanisms of accountability. We cannot really take at face value, these two belligerents talking about, accountability. And so that's really important to keep in mind. In terms of the ICC, I think that you're absolutely right. It's very ineffectual, but what I do feel is important is for regional countries, and here I'm talking about the African Union. I know that this is debatable, but I think in terms of accountability, it's important to really kind of make and be sure that the African Union has a lead with respect to the issues of accountability as they begin to discuss not only negotiations, ceasefire negotiations and peace in Sudan, but also a transition to democracy. We must continue to emphasize that the ultimate outcome is, number one, of course, ceasefire and peace, but returning to a transition to full civilian democracy. Because without that, we cannot have a conversation about accountability that's impartial and that addresses all of the horrors that have happened and injustices in Sudan, which I think is important. I did want to mention about the international community, and I began this interview by saying that or referencing the Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Borders, who said this is a failure of humanity. What does that mean? It means, number one, the very notion of supporting the ending of the UN peacekeeping mission is not only gravely disappointing, but it is a failure of humanity. It's very clear that the UN, even if they could not go into Khartoum, that they can go into Chad and at least signal to Sudanese refugees and displaced in Chad that they're there to support them. Number two, they could actually meet the donor pledge that was pledged by UN countries or countries in the UN. Only 20% of that has come forward. That is why I call it a failure of humanity. They refuse to recognize that the little aid that is there is being instrumentalized and manipulated and redirected by both of these belligerent parties. And I think in terms of what people can do, number one is people should understand that wars in Africa come to an end. That is the first and foremost. I have students from Sierra Leone and from Rwanda, from every African country that has gone through conflict. Wars do end, and that is really important to keep in mind. How do they end? They end really through civilian participation, irrespective of what we think about the present regime in Rwanda or Sierra Leone. The role of civil society is the only kind of way to actually realize the end of a war, whether it ends in one military victory or one party. It's clear in Sudan it's a stalemate, like in other countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone, for example. And here, what people can do is to support civil society in Sudan and outside. And to do everything possible to help them to coordinate their own organizational strength. That is the specifics of that we can discuss, but I work closely with the Sudan Doctors Union, the resistance committees, even artists in Sudan, in and outside. And they need logistical support, moral support, financial support, and we have a whole range of organizations in Sudan and outside. For example, if you don't mind me just emphasizing, the failure of humanity on the international kind of front has not ended the volunteerism of the resistance committees, who have transformed from pro-democracy activists into aid suppliers and deliverers. Not only in Khartoum, which is very difficult, but now they've spread out throughout the regions of Sudan where it's more peaceful. And they're there providing services, humanitarian aid. The Sudanese diaspora sends funds through a network in order to support Sudanese outside of the capital. As you know, 60% of Sudanese from the capital have fled to safer areas, akin to what happened in the Somalia war. And so there's a great deal that can be done to enhance that capacity outside of Khartoum, where 60% of the displaced from Khartoum have had to flee. And so supporting civil society in any way possible, and making sure to understand that, this persistent notion in Sudan and elsewhere that you can suddenly transform military generals who are intent on destroying the country, their own country, for their own political and economic gain, can somehow overnight be reformed into democrats is preposterous. It's preposterous in the case of Sudan. It's illogical. It's unworkable, and that can be said in all African countries. Their record is clear. They have no interest in a transition to a civilian democracy. They have no interest, as the Secretary General said on Tuesday, in the interest of their own population. And so these are not generals that can be reformed in ways that the US and Saudi Arabia are trying to do. And so we really must focus on civil society. And I can guarantee from being a professor of African politics that this war too shall end.
Thank you so much for being on Let's Just Talk. We really appreciate you being here, and we look forward to continuing these conversations with you.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor, and to be in the midst of another Brown alumni, it's just it's a real delight.
It's great being here. Thank you.